So I feel like this is the first of its kind in Melbourne, talking about psychedelic drugs openly, without bias, just looking at the evidence. And I hope there's more of this to come, and I hope it's not just people within the drug-taking community that are open to these ideas, but people in wider society as well. So hopefully today we can tell you something and teach you a little bit what drugs do to the brain and what they do to what their effects are, both positive and negative, and hopefully we can show you something novel today.
So, psychedelic drugs, a history in therapy. Human beings have ingested plant-based psychedelics for millennia, both recreationally, medicinally, for celebration. But it was only on a spring day in 1943 that someone just began to look at it scientifically. Albert Hofmann, a pharmacologist at Sandoz, accidentally dosed himself with a chemical he was researching, lysergic acid diethylamine. And this is a cute little picture of what happened to him that day, because he went for a bicycle ride, not really knowing what to expect, and during it became rather entranced by a world not quite like the material one we know. And actually a print of this is available up for auction later this evening during dinner. So, the psychedelic experience. The word psychedelic is derived from the Greek psyche, which mind, and delos, which is to manifest. So mind manifesting or mind revealing, and that really is what they do. This term was actually coined by psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond in a poem to Aldous Huxley, the famous writer. To fathom hell or soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic. The term stuck. So characteristics. Ineffability, probably the most frustrating one to scientists. Experiences that are beyond the conventional world and require similes and metaphors and references to supernatural, spiritual things that, makes scientists uncomfortable. Makes me uncomfortable even. But science does like to quantify and qualify things, and that's why Wallenwater in 2008 derived the psychological dimensions of altered states of consciousness measurements, which is three of. One, oceanic boundlessness, which is a positive, maybe even ecstatic feeling of limitlessness and an interconnectedness with nature and all that is. It's almost like a feeling of a loss of interest, of self-relatability and a focus to the outside world. And also an enhancement of appreciation of the sensory world. There's also ego dissolution, which is sometimes an anxious ego dissolution, or the dread of ego dissolution, because it is quite scary, the loosening of self-representation that does occur, sometimes associated with feelings of personal endangerment, but not always. In fact, we find that people's ability to be mindful is correlated to how well they can achieve this state. Then there's also visionary restructuralization, which is, I guess, the process of restructuring your world now that the foundations of it have been shaken so thoroughly by these chemicals. And that can include the visual changes that occur, synesthetic experiences, and shiftings in meanings of percepts. Interestingly, these three facets also relate to the strength of therapeutic use. We find that the more people appreciate these three things, the more the benefits are received in psychotherapy. So,
now I can tell you about psychedelic drugs. So, there's the classic psychedelics that you might be familiar with are what we call the serotonergic psychedelics, and they consist of two different classes of compounds. Typically tryptamines what people would refer to, including LSD and dimethyltryptamine or DMT. And then we also have phenethylamines, which were primarily promoted and created by a man named Sasha Shulgin. May he rest in peace. Amen. And include a variety of different compounds, including the N-bomes and the DO compounds. We also have lesser associated with the word psychedelic compounds, such as the entactogens or empathogens. This is something like MDMA, so this would induce a state of connectedness and empathy, and very much a loss of self as well. We then have chemicals known as dissociatives, and this includes things like ketamine, PCP, or MXC. And finally, we have cannabinoids, and this includes cannabis and also synthetic-derived cannabinoids, not synthetic cannabis, because they're completely different things. Synthetic-derived cannabinoids that might act via the same receptors but have very different effects to cannabis itself.
So what makes the psychedelic state ideal for therapy? There is a relaxation of mental defenses, an increased availability of conscious and unconscious material, a more frequent experience of sudden insight. Sudden insight is a recorded neurological phenomenon where unconscious material is processed by a part of the brain that we are unaware of, and answers can just appear in our head. An example is like the eureka moment. Increased openness to experience and awareness of alternative options, and curiosity into the content of one's mental landscape, which I feel like is very important. And these characteristics do contrast to current pharmacological treatments, such as anxiolytics and benzodiazepines, which allow for relief from anxiety-provoking thoughts. Psychedelics may not allow relief from anxiety-provoking thoughts, and that can be a complication with recreational use. But in therapy, during a guided session, this can be actually exactly what someone needs to face their problems. And antidepressants, SSRIs, and antipsychotics, which often produce a flattened effect, which can be very useful in acute depression. And it could be said that these states do provide a shortcut to mindfulness, which is a state usually achieved by long-term practice of daily meditation. Some meditators believe that this is a cheat sway, but in fact what it is opening a door. Somewhere where you can say, well, maybe that's where I want my brain to be one day, with practice. Some considerations though. There is unpredictability of effects, particularly with the classic serotonergic psychedelics. But this is largely reliant on set and setting due to an increase relying on state dependence and sensitivities to associations in the environment. So in therapy, these factors can be managed fairly easily by the guides or therapists, but again, that's where we get the problems in recreation. They are difficult to study. They're hard to have randomized blind trials because it becomes fairly obvious when someone enters a psychedelic state in terms of their behaviour. And that ineffability of mystical states again.
Okay, so now I'm going to walk you through just a very brief history, because I know some of the other speakers are going to go into more detail about these substances. So, as we alluded to at the start, it all began around the 50s and 60s after Hofmann invented LSD. And these were initially given to patients, given to psychiatrists as tools for psychotherapy before they became recreational drugs. And they were used as adjuncts, so they would give them LSD to treat a variety of problems, and then they would undergo therapy whilst under the influence of these substances. It was used to treat things like alcohol addiction, OCD, clinical depression, and end-of-life anxiety. Now, before these were taken up by recreational use in the 60s, this was administered by certain researchers. So in particular, Osman and Hoffer who were using it to treat alcohol addiction, gave it to 2,000 patients by the end of the 60s, with 40 to 45% remaining into remission by the end of after 1 year of treatment, which is a pretty amazing statistic considering what we now know about remission to alcohol and other drugs. And this therapy involved administering a single dose of LSD, single high dose of LSD, and then undergoing psychotherapy, whereas other people have used multiple lower doses. So over 4,000 articles were published on LSD for alcohol addiction. However, the one problem, as Melissa alluded to before, was that there was no, or almost no, randomized controlled trials done. So we weren't able to show for sure how LSD is working and whether or not it is more beneficial than control. But there was some, and very recently, last year, a couple of years ago, there was a meta-analysis conducted where they looked at all of the results from these randomized controlled trials and combined their effects and see what the end result was. And what they found was that LSD did perform significantly better than controls. And in fact, when we looked at the results and looked at the clinical relevance of the effect, it was equivalent to that of our only current pharmacological treatment, naltrexone. However, these effects were lost after about 1 year, which is still pretty okay for a single dose of treatment. So, as you can imagine, with this drug being administered all around and all these studies being performed, there was numerous citations that got exponentially larger over the years. However, then it was during the 70s, or at the start of the 70s, that the war on drugs began. And so what we notice here is that after Nixon government declares the war on drugs, we see a dramatic decrease in the amount of studies being done on these substances. And then if we look over here, what we're looking at here is the amount of incarcerations during the same period. So this is quite stable during the years leading up to 1970. And then after Nixon declared the war on drugs, we see a massive increase in incarceration. So what we're doing is we're losing all of our research on these drugs and increasing the amount of people incarcerated subsequently. Doesn't seem very beneficial to society. So this is just starting our little timeline of what we've seen so far. LSD is being researched in the 50s and 60s, and this stopped in the 1970s. So I'll let now Melissa talk about what makes this and the psychedelic state ideal for therapy.
So we discussed what makes it ideal for therapy and the promise that these drugs showed. And then unfortunately, this was no longer allowed, at least with serotonergic drugs, like the classical psychedelics. But in the 70s, MDMA started to have a prevalence amongst therapists, far before it became a recreational drug. MDMA is known as an entactogen or an empathogen, which creates a touching within. It was originally used as a therapeutic drug, and we estimate 4,000 therapists with 200,000 patients used this drug prior to its ban in 1986. We discussed before how one of the problems with psychedelic therapy is their unpredictability. With MDMA, this is lessened. Unlike traditional psychedelics, there is a greater predictability of results. There is an opening of the therapeutic window that the therapist can pry into the trauma or the issues of the patient, where psychic material is maximised and stress minimised. Rick Dublin's has quoted, it helps you trust in the process of opening up and to see that even with difficult things, feeling them and integrating them is the best choice. Because of its very pleasant effects, it became a popular club drug in the 80s, and the scientific community did not publish many papers, unfortunately. It was difficult to get these studies put together prior to the ban, despite an overwhelming number of therapists who actually wrote into the DEA with a lawsuit trying to prevent the ban. And in 1986, it was banned, and Rick Dublin was the man who started MAPS. Okay, so now we've had two stories looking at LSD
and also at MDMA, where we see beneficial effects for therapy, and in both cases the government has shut down effectively being able to do research on these substances, not even regulating them, not even just criminalising the drugs, but also shutting down the research on them. And because of this, we're starting to see a loss of potential therapeutic options for things like addiction and anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder. So what about some of the other psychedelics we're talking about? So ketamine has originally been used as an anesthetic. It was then used as a psychotomimetic, which means it was used to replicate a psychosis state in humans. But now it's used as an antidepressant. So the first proof of concept trial looking at a randomized controlled trial for ketamine as an antidepressant was performed in the year 2000. And subsequently there's been multiple different randomized controlled trials performed up until last year. And because we've done this, we've been able to do a meta-analysis on the effects of ketamine looking at depression. So there's been several double-blind randomized controlled trials. All of them show a strong antidepressant effect. This happens after a single acute dose. So whereas with antidepressants, you have to be administered for 3 weeks straight daily, which then might induce a very strong anxiety to start off before you feel any therapeutic numbing effects of the antidepressants. What we see with ketamine is that a single dose of ketamine intravenously for 40 minutes actually leads to an instant antidepressant effect. And even more startling is this occurs in treatment-resistant depression. So we're not just talking about someone that's had their first bout of depression when they've turned 20 or 21. We're talking about people that may suffer from lifelong depression and have tried 2 to 4 different treatments, and this is being effectively treated with ketamine. This is very interesting in 2 different ways. One, it's a completely different action to what we use with classical antidepressants. So classical antidepressants will target serotonin systems, such as SSRI, or maybe just monoamine systems using SNRIs. This is looking at glutamate. So it's a completely different mechanism to what we're used to looking at. This does 2 things, because ketamine does have a potential for abuse, which means that it's hard to get this out there for people to treat themselves. But it also offers up, by researching the mechanisms by this works, we can get new drugs which target the same systems with less potential for abuse. And currently, Australia is actually leading the way with this research, and we have a larger trial being conducted at the University of Sydney. So now we just need this to happen with MDMA as well. And finally, I'll just have a brief mention of psilocybin, which is the active ingredient of magic mushrooms. But I won't talk in too much detail because Olivia is going to touch on this. So it's been used to treat terminal patients with end-of-life anxiety. This is associated with the mystical experiences that this substance induces. And it's also the most important thing that I want to mention. This is the first drug that's shown that these psychedelics can change personality traits. So after a single dose that occasioned a mystical experience in users, it led to an increase in openness to experience, which is something which has previously been thought to be a stable trait over life. So I'll let Melissa finish off and talk about what is happening in the brain with these substances.
So thankfully there has been a bit of a psychedelic science revolution in the last 10 years or so, and we've been able to actually see what's happening in the brain using brain imaging studies. So patients under the effect of LSD and psilocybin will actually undergo an fMRI to see where activity is changed compared to baseline experience in the brain. And one of the key and most noticeable changes is in what's called the default mode network. The default mode network is a synchronized region of activity along the midline of the brain, and it's often associated with things like rumination, self-referential thinking, and is correlated to have higher activity in states of depression and anxiety. It's also associated with reduced activity in frequent meditators. What we see with psilocybin and LSD is that, like the meditative state, the default mode also shows decreased activity, which can definitely suggest how some of these drugs are working in the brain and why they do offer such hope for people who do suffer from these mental illnesses. thanks to brain imaging, we can also correlate the areas of activity associated with the states I was talking about before, so oceanic boundlessness, ego dissolution, and visionary reconstructualization, and see where that's happening in the brain. This is sort of looking, I guess, at the easy problem. The hard problem is knowing why these states do occur, the phenomenology, which is not something we can quite approach yet, but we are getting an understanding of where it's happening, and perhaps if we target these systems with these drugs or other drugs that maybe don't have some of the effects that limit therapy, we can offer new treatment strategies to people with various kinds of mental illness. So now we'd like to introduce Dr. Olivia Carter, who is part of the School of Psychology at the University of Melbourne. She'll be having a talk focusing on psilocybin, psilocybin in the lab and clinic. So make Olivia feel welcome.